Um, so as was mentioned, I was here 4 years ago. Before the program started, I was able to do a little bit of touring. So I was here in Byron and was able to come to that cafe, but I wasn't here on a Sabbath, so I jumped at the opportunity to be able to be here with you. And something that we were warned about coming, having folks from all over different countries who may not necessarily have the beach as readily available, was that we were warned about rips. Has anyone ever been caught in a rip here? I did not grow up being a beach person per se. I always considered myself more of a mountain person. And it wasn't until I came to Australia where I thought, well, had I been born and grew up here, then yeah, I would absolutely be more of a beach person. It's just that it wasn't that close of a drive for us. And even when you got there, they weren't as beautiful as the ones you have here. And so I definitely, coming back, wanted to enjoy that a lot more. And fortunately, the apartments that we're staying in, we have the beach right behind the place that we're staying. And so last week I was enjoying a bit of that at the beach, but I got caught in a rip. And all I could think was, okay, don't freak out, don't freak out, don't freak out. And of course, the natural instinct, again, if you are not familiar with that, is to try to swim against the current, like towards the shore, right? But of course, that's counterproductive, and I could feel my hamstrings and thinking, this is such a workout right now. And so I was told we're supposed to swim to the side. And afterward, some of the other girls arrived at the beach as well, and so I was sharing with them what had happened, and they said, yeah, I got caught in the beach on a rip as well, but there were two of them. One of our friends is from Norway, so again, not, not this sort of setting, and then our other friend is from Austria. And so the friend who's from Austria said that she had been caught in the rip, but our friend from Norway was still on the shore. And so the one caught in the rip was, kind of waving over at the friend on the shore, and the friend on the shore was just like, hi, thinking that she was just having fun as she's getting pulled away. And so it's quite an insight as to how temperamental the ocean can be, right? It can be something that you're enjoying 1 minute, and then the next, something that you're fighting against and trying to save your life, right? And so we're going to study a story that speaks to that as well. And it's a story that's found in the book of Luke. And so we have a Bible in front of you, or also, I believe we can be able to share it on the screen. And so if you'll join me, Luke is in the New Testament. It's the fourth gospel, so Matthew, Mark, Luke. And we'll be opening up to this short story that I want to spend a little bit of time in Luke chapter 8, verses 22 to 25. Luke chapter 8, verses 22 to 25. And so I see we have it there on the screen. And I'll go ahead and read from that one. My version's a little different, but that way we can follow along together. It says, now it happened on a certain day that he got into a boat with his disciples. And he said to them, let us cross over to the other side of the lake. And they launched out. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in jeopardy. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. Then he arose and rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was a calm. But he said to them, where is your faith? And they were afraid and marveled, saying to one another, Who can this be? For he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him. So again, we have this story where it's quite a dangerous situation. Again, not being familiar with having a boat, for example. I've never quite experienced a boat that's sinking, or you can imagine the stress as water is starting to fill in more and more. But again, I have been in a situation where you're in the middle of the ocean or some body of water, and again, you're just trying to stay calm, and it's survival mode, right? They said, this is a dangerous situation. We're perishing. We feel like we're dying here. And so we have this situation where you see the reaction approached in two completely different ways. You have how the disciples are reacting, but we also see how Jesus is, and he's, oddly enough, sleeping, which is not necessarily what our natural inclination would be, right? If you're experiencing a storm, again, for me, is like, I gotta get out of this rip, right? I'm a little bit in a desperate situation here. And I had the opportunity to visit Israel just before I came to Australia the first time, and was able to go out on a boat in the Sea of Galilee. I remember looking around thinking, I completely understand why they were afraid. It's not some small lake. It's a quite large body of water. And while it's beautiful to look at, right, when things are calm, I can't imagine what it would be like to experience a storm there. And we have to remember as well, the disciples, many of them were fishermen by trade. So if there is anyone who would be able to navigate that sort of situation, that's what they did professionally. They were used to navigating these storms. But this was a storm such that even they were like, we can't do this on our own. We need something bigger. We need help. We're not able to navigate this the way that we've navigated other storms. And so they couldn't just use their own skills. The same story is recounted in the Gospel of Mark. And in Mark, it depicts the disciples saying to Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing? And so in these desperate situations, sometimes we can look up to God and say, why is this happening? Right? Don't you see what's happening? Don't you care that this is occurring to me? And why aren't you doing something about it? And so, again, we see the reaction that the disciples had, but I think there's also lessons to learn in how Jesus composed himself during this situation. And so in the first verse that we read, verse 22, I'd like to just draw out some lessons from each of these verses and just go section by section. The first one says that one day he got into a boat with his disciple. Just with that first part, we learn that Jesus is in the boat, right? Sometimes we're in situations in the middle of a storm, forgetting that Jesus is in the boat with us. And he said to them, let us go across to the other side of the lake. This was Jesus' bidding. This was Jesus going with them. And so we can learn from this that Jesus will never allow us to go through a situation that he himself would not be in. And in the midst of those storms, again, Jesus is in the boat with us. It's not that he's some distant God watching you go through something, right? It's not like our friend on the shore who's like, hi, right? And not aware that there's actually a dangerous situation watching you just wade in the water, right? It's someone who's in it with you. It's someone who's experiencing that with you. If you are hurt and broken, a true friend who is able to sympathize with you and hurt with you is probably the most valuable thing that you can have in a difficult situation. Sometimes people don't know what to say. Sometimes it might be a little awkward trying to comfort someone going through a difficult situation. But the best thing that you could do is simply be with them. Let me come and just sit next to you and cry with you. And so, again, whatever storm we're in, Jesus is in the boat. The second thing that I want to draw from this is, again, Jesus was sleeping. And he was sleeping, or was able to sleep, because he had complete trust and faith in his Father. He wasn't concerned about whether or not God the Father cared that he was in the storm, right? It wasn't even a question in his mind. Of course God cares. Of course he's going to protect me. Of course he's going to see me through this. Not to mention how many other things had God provided for? How many other things had the Father instructed him to, or given him power to do miracles, right? Surely he can also take care of this. When we think about what having complete trust in your Father looks like, just picture if a child were in this situation with his father. It's too much to process, too much to think about what the possible solution is. And so all you could probably do as a kid is, again, if your father's right next to you, hold on to him for dear life, right? Just cling on to your father. And you're hoping and trusting that if it's a father who loves you, they're going to do everything possible to protect you. And so in the same way, when we are going through difficult situations, do we have that childlike trust in our Father? Are we holding on to God for dear life? Are we looking to Jesus, who again is in the boat with us, to see us through that situation? And finally, Jesus asks them in verse 25, he says, "Where is your faith?" It says that they were afraid and they marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this that he commands even winds and water and they obey?" In a sense, they allowed the storm, the waves, watching the water fill the boat little by little, distract them from the answer or from the person who could provide that peace, that comfort, that solution. When the focus is on what's happening around you, it takes our eyes off of the person that can help us, and then we're just focusing on how big the problem is. When really, God is a God of the impossible, which is why they marveled and saying, "Who is this man?" Right? Like, they've seen him do other miracles. He's healed the sick. But this is a situation where he's now commanding nature itself. And so it's not just anyone who's in the boat with you. It's someone who can do the impossible. And Jesus is asking them, "Where is your faith? You've been with me. You've witnessed all these other miracles. Is this not too possible for me to bring you through?" And so I want to share with you a personal experience. In the last about 3 years of my life, where I can attest to this being true. And I'll tell you that the storm or the situation in life may not be resolved, but the way that you navigate the situation, the way that you approach life can be radically different than the way that someone approaches life who doesn't have that same hope, who doesn't have that same trust. You can experience the same kind of peace that Jesus had, enough for him to sleep in the middle of the storm. About almost 3 years ago, so in 2021, my father was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And he was given about 6 months to live. And at that time, I was also looking for a job, and I thought this was my dream job. And I made it all the way to the last round of interviews. It was just down to myself and another person. But the same day that I received the call about not getting that job was the day that I received the call about my dad. And so the thing that I thought was a disappointment turned out to be a blessing, because my dad went through 2 months of intensive treatment. And I was able to stay home with him or take him to those appointments and navigate that very difficult situation for my family with him. Every night for the first 2 months, I'd either cry or at least tear up. And there's a song that's called "I'll Raise a Hallelujah." And one of the lines says, "I'll raise a hallelujah in the middle of the mystery." And in the chorus it says, "I'm going to sing in the middle of the storm. Higher and higher, I'll let my praises roar." And so I would sing that through tears. Knowing that I was losing my dad, but that we as a family were going to praise God anyway. Even though that itself was extremely difficult, we could still see God's hand leading. He was providing for us every step of the way. In 2021, we're still dealing with different, thank you. We were still dealing with different variants for COVID. And so, of course, that was backing up the medical system. Folks who hadn't had care from years before were now able to get it, but then the new cases were difficult to get appointments for. And so I was calling different oncologists because we needed to start treatment with him as soon as possible. But they wouldn't give me an appointment for months later, until months later. And my mom, she works for a pediatrician, and they had a family friend who was an oncologist. But even then, you need a specific kind of oncologist, right? There's different types of cancer. And so she said she didn't quite remember what type of oncologist he was. And so she just reached out to him. And when she heard back, it turned out that not only was he a specialist for the type of cancer that my dad was, he was the head of the department for a renowned known hospital in Washington, D.C. And so after she reached out to him, we didn't even have to call to make the appointment. He had his nurse reach out to us, and we were able to see him just a few days later. Again, it was also a blessing that I was able to stay home with my dad. So even in that way, God was providing. I was also telling a friend about the situation, and she tells me, Emily, don't pay for anything. Um, as you may or may not know, healthcare in the States is quite expensive, especially when it's this ongoing type of treatment. And so that was another worry financially, right? But she says, don't pay for anything. Whenever you get a bill, send it to us. A few years before, she and her husband had started a chapter of the American Cancer Society. And so they had raised funds for a friend of theirs that had cancer, but that person had then passed away. And so they had funds that they had raised, and she says, we have to use these funds, but it can only be for a cancer patient. And so that was something else that was taken care of. 2 months after treatment, my dad, he's the kind of person that can't just stay at home. and he says, I'm ready to go back to work. And so then I think, okay, I should probably find a job too. And then the next organization that I applied for, within a matter of weeks, I started my job there, which is the nonprofit that I was working at just before I came back this time. And that was also such a blessing because prior to that, I was a high school teacher. And of course, it just doesn't offer as much flexibility to be able to take my dad to appointments or stay home with him if I needed. And so with this job, I only had to go into the office 1 day a week, or if need be, I could just take my laptop with me to the hospital and be there with my dad or stay home with him. And so God provided a job for me that I needed just in that season. There would be times where my brother and I would kind of tag team and just take turns. Since I had to go into work on Tuesdays, my brother had to be in the office on Mondays and Wednesdays. So it's another thing that would just work out. We also did as much traveling with my dad as we could to visit family so that he could spend time with them. And my family's from El Salvador, which is in Central America. And I had visited throughout my life, but these last 2 years, I've been there like never in my life before. And my dad, more than ever, I saw him making these trips, not just to visit family, but they were mission trips to him because he cared so much about making sure that his family also heard the message. And they respected him so much that he invited everyone to church. And so that was the first time that we had so much of our family at church. And it made him so happy to have him there. My dad, he was also the kind of person that people would come to try to encourage him because obviously he's the one going through a difficult situation. But his faith was so strong that you were the one who left encouraged. And in August of 2023, just a few months ago, that was the last trip that we weren't able to make because I had to take him to the emergency room, which then turned into intensive care for that week. And when you arrive at the hospital, they always offer for a chaplain to come by and visit. And so my dad said that he would like a chaplain. But I jokingly said, Dad, you don't really need a chaplain. You're the one who's preaching to all these people. And he said to me, you never want to miss an opportunity to share the hope that you have. So many of these chaplains go visit patients who don't have hope. So many of them go visit people who do need that encouragement. He says, but it'll be encouraging to them to see the hope that we have. And so they would come to the room, of course, asking him how he was doing, how his hope was. And there my dad was, talking about how he wasn't afraid to die. And so I thought it funny because even though my dad couldn't go out to preach, he just took advantage of being able to have someone come to him. And any nurse or doctor or cleaning staff that would come, he would always thank them and told them that he was praying for them. That's what it's like to go through a storm knowing that Jesus is in the boat with you. After a while, after a few days, my dad was doing better in the intensive care unit, and he was so ready to go home. And the other thing that he was worried about was he told me, I was working on the sermon. I hope I'm able to finish my sermon. And I'm just thinking, like, that's what you're concerned about. And so the week after he got home, he was so excited. He told me he was able to finish the sermon and he was hoping that God would give him the opportunity to be able to preach it. So that week, somebody canceled last minute. And the pastor sent out a message to all the elders saying that he had reached out to 14 people and that no one was available. Mind you, he had just come out of the intensive care unit, so we weren't even sure if he was going to make it to church just to attend. Next thing I know, he tells me he's so excited because he's going to be preaching. And so I'm just praying that God gives him the strength, to even be able to speak that long, because there were nights where he would have insomnia, and so he would just be tired, and then you could hear it in his voice how weak he was. But the night before, I had this dream that he was preaching so powerfully and with a strong voice. And that's what happened. I remember looking at him and thinking, you would never know just by looking at him. And so excitedly, I asked him, so were you able to sleep last night? And he said, no, but God gave me strength. So again, I wouldn't have even known that he hadn't slept at all that night. But he was just happy that he was able to share. And then that Thursday, he passed away. So even on his last Sabbath, he was able to do what was in his heart, and God granted that to him. Looking back, it's just being so thankful that we were able to experience so much with him. Those last 2.5 years were just such up and downs of him being okay for a few months and then there being an emergency. And during that time, my brother got married, where the week before, my dad had emergency brain surgery and we weren't sure if he was able to make it, but he was. And then my nephew was born, so my dad at least got to meet him. And again, it was just such a powerful testimony watching him go through that. I can't tell you how many people at church have come up to me and said that my dad was some sort of spiritual father or mentor to them. My dad, he was the one who always encouraged me to preach as well. Again, if anybody needed a speaker last minute, he either volunteered or asked me if I wanted to. And there was one time where he had volunteered to preach, but then an emergency came up and he was in the hospital, so then I had to fill in for the fill-in. And he sent me in his place while my mom stayed with him in the hospital. And so preaching is a way that that I can carry on my dad's legacy and do what he's no longer able to do. About 6 months after my dad passed away, my grandmother, his mom, passed away. A month after that, my dad's cousin passed away. And so it just seemed like this season where my family couldn't catch a break. And that's what led me to coming back. Even though I wasn't able to finish the program last time, it was such a healing and spiritual experience that I knew this would better equip me to carry out that work of sharing with people. And just before I left to come back to Australia, I had the opportunity to preach back home. And that morning, it dawned on me that it would be the first time that I would be preaching when my dad wouldn't be there, because he always came to support. Unless one time he also had to preach at another church, so that was pretty cool too, being able to do that at the same time. But the verse that came to mind was in the story of when Mary and Joseph lost track of where Jesus was when he was little, and they found him in the temple, and his response to them was that he was about his Father's business. And so that morning I thought to myself, I'm about my Father's business when I preach, but twofold. And how cool is it that the thing that I feel like draws me closer to my dad is also the thing that draws me closer to God. And that's a legacy that I want to carry on. And the example that I left for me is an example that I want to leave for others. More importantly, I want to pass on the example of learning how to praise God even in the midst of a storm. I watched my dad be faithful throughout this whole process, even till his last breath. But he was only able to do that because he wasn't alone. Jesus was in the boat with him. God never said that life would be easy, but he did promise to be with us always. And that's something I can testify to. Has the message been clear this morning? I don't know what you're going through or what you will go through, but I'm here to tell you to not be distracted by the storm or the water that's filling in, and it could be one thing after another that causes you to be in a desperate situation. Just remember that Jesus is in the boat with you. The situation itself might not change, but you can change as a person, because God can give you a peace that surpasses all understanding. And that's the thing that will equip you to navigate and surpass that situation. I know it helped me and my family navigate terminal cancer. So my prayer for you is that you get to experience the peace when you know that Jesus is in the boat too.